Hello, today we're going to be looking at the colonists and their way of life in the 1700s. So we're primarily looking at around 1630 to about the turn of the century of 1700. Now, as first, let's start off with the population. Of course, much of the population are going to be immigrants because this is the period of time when certainly English are traveling over the Atlantic Ocean to get to North America. They are trying to colonize, settle colonies, establish themselves in North America. So the general breakdown is in the 1630s to 1640, you had generally Puritans. This was caused, of course, by the elements going on in England where they were persecuting the Puritans. Now in the 1660s, generally you're getting aristocrats and indentured servants coming over to North America, and we'll get into indentured servants, what they are, and how that whole aspect comes into play. In the 1670s, you generally had Quakers, and then the turn of the century, basically the 1700s, you had the Scots and the Irish. Certainly, we're not just saying that only religious groups came over to North America. Certainly, there was the aspect of overpopulation and the economy that many people were coming over to North America as well. So keep that in mind. But by 1750, and certainly by 1700, many of these colonies had been established. Their conditions had improved to the point where they were self-sustaining, as least through agriculture. They had their own economy, and essentially the dangers of trying to find food or Indian attacks or war had subsided. So about 1750, we can estimate about 1 million colonists lived in the North American colonies. By 1775, just prior to the Revolutionary War, you had about 2.5 million colonists. So this number was climbing certainly by 1700, both by immigration, but also by natural procreation as well, since the situation had stabilized. So the population rose very, very rapidly due to immigration primarily, but also an increasingly secure environment in North America. So, what I mean by a secure environment was they were having improved living conditions. Many of the colonists had figured out how to farm in this new land. They had discovered, for example, by the Native Americans, corn. They started growing a variety of different vegetables and crops to sustain themselves and be completely independent from England. Didn't have to rely yearly or bi-yearly ships to bring in supplies. And due to the abundance of farmland in North America, there wasn't really a shortage of food. You didn't have famines, for example. That's in part due to the low population in North America at the time anyway. But additionally, there was a plentiful supply of wood. What that meant was they could chop down a tree and use it for heat, as well as cooking. So the harsh winters, they were very, very harsh, but it wasn't too much of a concern because they could just go outside and get firewood and then warm themselves up. That wasn't necessarily something that could be done easily in Europe, whether it be England, France, or what would be the German states. They generally they didn't have a lot of trees, and sometimes those trees were used by the state for building ships or other building materials that were more of a state project. Certainly was going to be the case in England. And then disease was also a less of a concern in North America as well. Now, many of them, yes, diseases were still a problem. Sanitation still was a problem. People did get sick, they did get diseases. But since they weren't clustered together in tight confines, you didn't spread disease nearly as easily. And so with the increased food supply, as well as sparsely populated, they didn't run into problems with disease nearly as often as those on the European continent. So in America, people could actually live to about 70 years old, which was higher than what you saw in Europe. For example, you're talking more around maybe 50, 60 years as life expectancy. So you're gaining about a decade on the Europeans. Marriage and childbearing was also done at a much younger age in North America. In part, that was due to the lack of women in North America at the time. So they're generally the ratio was 8 guys to 1 woman. So she generally had the pick of the crop, as it were. And they generally did start as soon as they got married. And that would start maybe roughly around 20, while in Europe they might get married in their mid-20s or late 20s. So that allowed for a greater amount of children as they were married younger, and so the population increased in that as well. And since the North American colonists had more of an abundance of food, generally they were healthier to withstand childbearing. Because at this time, childbearing was the #1 killer of women. If they were not having enough nutrition, that ran into a risk for their health of themselves as well as the child. But since there was such an abundance of food in North America, they generally were healthier than those in Europe for bearing children. So generally, they did live healthier lives in North America rather than those who lived in Europe. And now it is going to take some time to get to that point. Certainly it's going to take till the 1650s, in some cases later, but definitely by 1700 the standard of living had rose to the point that they could certainly compete with the European lifestyle. Alright, moving on to the next phase. Generally that's the population, but the major concern with the colonies at first is you have an established colony, you have people, you have a food supply. Now, what's the economy like? Now, in northern North America, the northern states, generally the economy there was furs, hunting, but also wood. They could sell the wood for use in ships, or sell it to England to make big warships or other merchant ships, while the middle to southern colonies generally focused more on cash crops. Now each of these states, all 13 colonies, are going to grow their own food, whether it be wheat or corn or rice or some other sort of food that can be used to sustain the population. But the middle and southern economies were going to be reliant more so, at least, on making money from essentially cash crops. That could be tobacco, that could eventually be cotton. So that runs into the problem of labor. Tobacco farming as well as cotton, when we eventually get down to that, is very labor intensive. So the first question is, where are they going to get this labor to perform the work? Part of the problem was, at least at the beginning, certainly in the 1600s, 1620s, 30s, 40s, 50s, there wasn't a great amount of population in North America at that time. Families were procreating very slowly, and they would have to wait for the children to be of a decent age to actually do the work. So they couldn't really rely on their families necessarily for the work. So the next phase was, okay, is there anybody around North America we could use for labor? The obvious question would be the Native Americans. But the Native Americans generally were susceptible to diseases, and any contact with the Europeans in North America, they contracted smallpox or some other sort of disease and the Native Americans would die. Now, certainly there were some Native American slaves who did work in these fields, but for the most part, it wasn't a great population to rely on. So then they looked abroad to, for example, South America or the Caribbean. Now, the Portuguese and the Spanish had established slave labor, and they had a slave trade going into that part of the world, but many of these slaves were too expensive for the colonists to actually afford, at least at this point. So they had to look back home to England for surplus labor. Now, in England, there was overpopulation, so many people were looking to get employed elsewhere for work. So there were quite a few Englishmen looking to get out of England for work, and so they basically advertised and looked for work in England. So essentially, what was going on in England is, yes, you had an overpopulation, but also landowners were also putting up enclosures, basically fences, and restricting where the middle to lower classes had access to. And so there was a huge surplus of workers who wanted to work, and many of them looked outside of England for that work. So what happened was the middle colonies as well as southern colonies started to advertise in England for workers. These workers are going to be called indentured servants. Now, these indentured servants, generally they signed a contract for 5 years of work. At the end of that term, and during that term, they could not marry, they could not have property, and so as a result, many of them refer to them as white slaves. Now, they worked for typically 5 years. After those 5 years were up, they would become free, and they were given a lot of land. And then they could hire themselves as laborers anywhere they wanted to, and they could marry, they could basically live their life however they pleased. Now, in the period of the 1600s, certainly by 1700, they brought over about 100,000 indentured servants. So there's plenty of servants out there to work the tobacco plantations, for example. Many of these were voluntary. They saw that there might be an opportunity in North America, so they voluntarily did that. But also, if you were arrested in England, you could basically get off being hanged or killed for a crime by voluntarily going to North America and becoming an indentured servant. Now, typically at the very beginning, it would be a 5-year contract, but eventually you're going to see 10-year contracts or even longer. But the hope, of course, was at the end of that term, you would be in North America, you would have a lot of land, you could start your own farm, and basically you would have economic opportunity to start your own family. Now, once they were free, they did offer their services to other farmers, but generally it was very low wages. Now, once many of these former indentured servants became free, they were fairly frustrated since in one part they did want to marry, they wanted to start their own family, but there weren't for a lot of women. But also, since they couldn't make a lot of money, that caused some problems as well. They couldn't, for example, afford to marry or court or even start a family, so that caused a large problem there too. But also, part of the problem was these landowners, these plantation owners, eventually they didn't want to give out any land. And so in 1670, the Virginia Assembly disenfranchised most of the landless servants. Basically, what they did is it was legal now to not offer any land at the end of their service. So once they had completed their 5-10 year service. Now they were no longer getting any land, and after their service, they could not really afford really much to live because their wage was so low. What this 1670 disenfranchisement did was it paved the way for Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, Bacon's Rebellion is going to be led by Nathaniel Bacon. It's going to break out, and this is in part due to the governor, Berkeley, Virginia's governor. What these indentured servants did was they went out and they just took land and just planted themselves on land and started to farm, or started to try make a lot for themselves. What this did was it raised tensions between the Native Americans and these colonies. The governor Berkeley, for example, did not want to start a war with the Native Americans. That would be very costly. It would cause war, which is not good for trade or the economy, and it could cause more problems, and that's not something that the governor Berkeley wanted. When these farmers went out there, they were attacked by the Native Americans because they viewed them as invaders, and technically they were, because there were treaties between these colonies and the Indians. And so they felt they were being invaded, and so the Native Americans essentially had little raids against these farmers. And so the indentured servants, or former indentured servants, asked the Virginia colony and Berkeley to defend them or retaliate against the Native Americans, but Berkeley refused. He didn't want war, he didn't want conflict, and so he did nothing. And so Nathaniel Bacon and many of his followers decided to revolt. They took matters in their own hands. They fought against the Native Americans. They also started a civil war with the colony of Virginia. This war ensued. You had certainly the indentured servants on one side, and you had the colony of Virginia on the other. So this caused quite a chaotic scene. Unfortunately, for Nathaniel Bacon, he is going to die from disease, and the rebellion is going to be eventually suppressed because they don't have a leader. So what this did, certainly it raised the issue of indentured servitude, but it also raised the issue that these plantation owners, these farmers who had these cash crops, were not encouraged to continue this sort of behavior by hiring indentured servants. So they're going to look elsewhere for laborers. In this case, this is going to be the start of slavery, at least in North America. Now, in the 1680s, you're going to see massive expansion of slavery. For example, 7 million Africans were going to come to the New World in a series of 3 centuries. About 400,000 are going to come to North America. So it is a very small fraction. Most of those slaves are going to go to the Caribbean to work the sugar cane, or to Central to South America. Now, the first African slaves were going to be bought by Jamestown in 1619. It was a hard life, and it really wasn't very fair or good for anyone involved, certainly the Africans. Now, the reason why trade, or the slave trade, did not flourish in North America till after the 1680s was much of the economy was not developed prior to that point to actually afford the slaves. But also with Bacon's Rebellion, they're going to be far more encouraged to have African slaves that would be uneducated, were not going to be granted their freedom, and they would be, for example, slaves for life. Basically, it was viewed as white servants were too costly and was a gamble, and so they started to shift over to African slaves. By the mid-1680s, African slaves started to outnumber the white indentured servants, so they were buying them up in droves. Now, much of this slave trade was a monopoly, at least by the English, by the Royal African Company, but it is going to lose its monopoly in 1698. And this is really where it starts to take off, at least in North America, because now anybody in North America or England can rush over to Africa, buy up African slaves, and then bring them over for a very lucrative trade sale. Now, most African slaves are going to come from the west coast, for example, Senegal or Angola. And most of these slaves are going to come from the Africans. Basically, slavery is not a new concept. Slavery has existed since essentially the beginning of time. If you remember, certainly in the Bible, you had mentions of slaves. You had the Israelites, for example, or the ancient Hebrews. There were slaves in the ancient Greek world, Roman world, ancient Egyptian world. You had slaves all around the world at one time or another, and slavery is going to be in Africa also for most of its time and continues even to this day. So what would happen generally is you would have wars between tribes or civilizations in Africa, and after a war, they would have those prisoners of war become slaves. This was not a new concept. This is how it worked, for example, in Europe as well as China, and certainly in Africa since the beginning of time, essentially. So how the Europeans were acquiring these slaves, they would go to settlements, they would go to port cities, and there would be people for sale. And so we would buy up the slaves, and then they would transport them across to the Caribbean and then sell them to whether it be South America, Central America, or North America. But what the Europeans did was it provided a very lucrative market for both parties. A very lucrative market for the slave traders, and a very lucrative market for the Africans. And with a large amount of people needed, for example, for tobacco, this was a very consistent market open. So the Africans were selling slaves for items like guns or metal axes or food or various other different items that they may want. And so this capitalism that the Europeans were using slowly accelerated the rate in which the Africans were going to be sold into slavery and brought over to the Americas. So basically what you have is trade from basically the western portion of Africa, and it is going to be sold into the Caribbean, North, and North America. And this is going to be known as the Middle Passage, since it's going right down the middle, straight across from Africa to the Americas, across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, in 1662, there were laws, some statutes, that defined essentially that slaves could be essentially owned for life. This ends, for example, any notion that any sort of slave was going to be freed after a period of time. Now, certainly it is going to be up to the slave master to decide if those slaves go free, but this starts the trend that slaves are going to be owned for life, and they start something called slave codes, which is going to make essentially slavery property. And this also extended to the children of slaves as well. So this is something that comes out of, for example, Virginia. And then it's going to spread to many of the other states who also have slaves. So now slaves can be owned for life. Slaves can also be treated as property legally, and their children are also going to be property of that slave master as well. In addition, This is also a result of the Bacon Rebellion. Some colonies are going to make it a crime to teach a slave how to read and write. This comes off of if individuals are educated, they're going to want more, and potentially they could have a rebellion of sorts and cause some problems, at least for the slave masters. So what they made it was a crime in some colonies anyway to educate the slaves. They also made a law that if slaves converted to Christianity, that would not qualify a slave for freedom either. That was something seen as a threat as well to basically this economy. And basically by the end of the 1700s, basically slavery was established in North America, and it was here to stay. It did take some time to come to America, but only in a matter of 20, 30 some years, slavery was established in North America, and it's not going to go away. Laws were put into place, and as a result, it was just a part of American life from this point onward. So it's hard to say if racial discrimination came before or after slavery was established, but certainly by 1700, many of the colonists did view the African slaves as inferior. This might have something to do with the fact that the belief of many of the colonists at this time, or at least the society at this time, was slavery was brought upon by individual choices. And so as a result, if you are a slave, that means that you may have screwed up in your life. Maybe you weren't a faithful Christian or some other sort of means. They also may have viewed that black was the color of evil and bad, and so they may have thought that it was justified. But nevertheless, certainly not going to end the debate on what comes first. It's basically a chicken and an egg sort of scenario. But by 1700, racial discrimination certainly was molded into the slave system in the colonies, and it would stay put there even to this day. But there were free Africans. Some of these Africans, at least in the early part, were indentured servants. They were freed after a 5 or 10 year term. So not all Africans were slaves. There were free Africans, but by and large, for the most part, that was not the case. Many of them were slaves. So that essentially is a short version of how slavery came to America. Essentially, it was a need for labor, and due to the rebellion, they didn't want to deal with that sort of Civil War rebellion again, and so they resorted to African slaves, and the system was going to be put into place until at least during and in some cases after the American Civil War. But discrimination certainly was not going to die at the end of the Civil War. But I'll leave this portion on slavery until we arrive at a later point. Certainly the Revolutionary War, this is going to come up, and it's going to come up in the years prior to the American Civil War. Like I said, I'll leave this here for now.